One Sunday, I was cooking the meal at Welcome Home congregation, and as usual, we prepared plenty of food so that our friends without homes would be able to fill takeout containers to take extra food home with them. And so, as usual, I arrived early at the church and began preparing the meal. About an hour before our service started, the meal always followed the service. One of our friends without homes brought in a large box filled with food that he had received from a local food pantry and soup kitchen for us to use. Well, I had not planned on this. My meal was already cooking and I really didn't need anything else. But our friend was clearly proud of his accomplishment, and especially two large Tupperware containers of soup. I think one was butternut squash and the other potato leek soup. And he said they were both really delicious soups and we needed to try them. I realized that even though I had already prepared the meal, I needed to let this man who had generously made efforts to bring us this food and add some soup to our menu for the day to do just that. And so we pulled back some of the food that I had prepared and we heated up one of his containers of soup. And it was indeed delicious, just as he had said. At the end of the meal, we not only had our usual extra food for people to take home, but lots of food to go in the freezer and in storage for subsequent weeks. We were blessed by generosity. That experience of having enough and to spare reminds me of the four gospel stories about the feeding of the thousands. And today, that gospel story, the feeding of the 5,000, forms our theme, blessed by generosity, and is based on the passage and version from the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns, and when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." And then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Matthew provides context for this gospel story. Jesus had just learned of the death of his cousin and friend John the Baptist. He knew that this meant that John's followers would be in need of a new leader, and Jesus likely understood that Jesus himself was that leader. So he seeks to be by himself, no doubt in grief and in need of a time for contemplation. So while Jesus traveled by boat to get to the place by himself, the crowds became aware of it and made their way by foot along the perimeter of the lake. A lake so large it was known as the Sea of Galilee. And they followed Jesus. And as the story is told by Matthew, Jesus took compassion on these people. He went in among them and cured the sick. As Julie Poulter, an editor for Sojourners, writes, while the natural focus here is the miracle part, the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, notice the other and more subtle works. The disciples are not rebuffed for thinking practically, but are given a hands-on role in the feeding and the moving among the crowd that they would have sent away. And while the gospel writer goes to the trouble to distinguish between those who were fed and who counted, the men, and those who were fed who didn't, the women and children, as the scene is described, Jesus made no distinctions. All ate and were satisfied. The lonely place apart, in the end, does become a place of rest. healing, and nourishment for the larger group, not just Jesus and the disciples. This is not a rejection of time spent alone with God. After the crowd is dispersed, Jesus goes into the mountains to pray alone. But in this case, the mystery being shown isn't that of the solitary seeker meeting God spirit to spirit. It is God shown through the humble, holy work of hospitality. The simple and the scarce become a feast. The reluctant become servants of bounty. And the people, all the people, taste, eat, and are filled. The People's New Testament commentary notices something else about this passage. The dramatic contrast between the lavish banquet being thrown by King Herod to impress and this miraculous banquet offered by the humble one who is the real spiritual king of the kingdom of God, Jesus. Notice that this miraculous feeding takes place in the desert wilderness, very much like the place where Jesus was tempted to turn the stones into bread. You remember that passage. So what is the difference here? Why did Jesus refuse to perform a miracle when tempted, but then orchestrate the miraculous feeding of the 5,000? Ewan Russell Jones, the chair of theology at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, suggests this. In many ways, this miracle is very much in keeping with a recurring theme in Matthew. Jesus' action flows out of compassion. Here and elsewhere in the gospel, he sees the people's need for health, for truth, for nourishment, for peace of mind, and is deeply moved. He has compassion on them because they are harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is gripped by the words of Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, it says in Hosea. And Jesus uses this text on more than one occasion to define and defend his ministry in the face of religious criticism. It seems as though his understanding of his entire mission with respect to the coming of God's kingdom is shaped by compassion. Late in the evening, in a place far from fast food outlets and shopping opportunities, mercy takes the form of bread. May we this day appreciate that it is Jesus' ongoing compassion that calls us to this moment. How can we but respond to such compassion and generosity?